Sir, this lane is restricted. Do you have authorization to be here?
Yes, I do. Would you like me to present my credentials?
Why should I allow you through this checkpoint?
Because I'm authorized under federal clearance. Is there an issue verifying?
Sometimes the universe possesses an incredible sense of poetic justice, delivering lessons so profound they echo through the halls of history and force society to look in the mirror. This is a story about what happens when absolute authority collides with absolute accountability. It is a masterclass in why we must constantly challenge our own preconceived notions, because the moment we allow unchecked bias and baseless assumptions to dictate our actions, we plant the seeds of our own destruction. This single event, captured by multiple lenses and broadcast to tens of millions of people in a matter of hours, dismantled an entire institution. If you are joining us for the first time, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from down in the comments. We dive deep into the stories that demand more than just a passing headline, and the one we are unpacking today is arguably one of the most critical narratives we have ever covered on this channel. To truly understand the gravity of what unfolded, you have to feel the atmosphere of a major metropolitan transit hub on a chaotic Monday morning. The Dallas Central Station was operating at maximum capacity, a sprawling theater of constant motion. It was just past 7 in the morning. The grand concourse echoed with the rolling thunder of luggage wheels, gliding over polished terrazzo floors, the overlapping chatter of thousands of commuters, and the automated cadence of departure announcements. Right near the center of this organized chaos stood the priority access corridor, a dedicated fast-track lane designed specifically for verified federal personnel and authorized law enforcement officials. Guarding this checkpoint was a transit officer who had stood at that exact spot for years, operating not on established legal protocols, but on deeply ingrained prejudices. Stepping off an overnight train from the Midwest was a man who carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who had spent decades leading others. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark professional tactical jacket over a crisp collared shirt. This man was not just a passenger, he was a highly decorated veteran chief of police from a major northern city. He had spent more than a quarter of a century navigating the complex worlds of patrol operations, internal affairs, and high-level department command. He was a pioneer of police reform, a leader who had implemented strict accountability measures long before they were required by law. And on this specific Monday, he was traveling under direct orders from the highest levels of the federal government. The Department of Justice had handpicked him to travel down south to serve as an independent, external investigator. His mission was highly sensitive. He was sent to investigate a local police department that had been plagued by severe allegations of systemic misjudgment, unjustified use of force, and a toxic culture of operating on unlawful assumptions rather than probable cause. As the visiting chief approached the priority corridor, his federal identification and his official government travel authorization were already out, held clearly in his hand, ready for a standard visual inspection. He moved with the routine ease of a man who had traversed hundreds of similar checkpoints throughout his distinguished career without a single issue. But the transit officer stationed at the entrance had been watching him from the moment he stepped into the hall. In the span of a few fleeting seconds, based entirely on a visual assessment rooted in severe bias and flawed assumptions, the officer made a decision. He decided without a shred of evidence or reasonable suspicion that this distinguished veteran did not belong in the privileged lane. Before the chief could even reach the stanchions, the officer stepped aggressively into his path, loudly declaring that the corridor was strictly reserved for verified federal agents. He dismissively pointed toward the crowded general exit at the far end of the terminal. The chief halted his momentum. Remaining perfectly calm and professional, he extended his credentials forward, clearly stating his rank, his jurisdiction, and his explicit federal mandate. In any lawful, standard interaction, this is where the encounter ends. But what happened next defied every principle of constitutional policing. The officer snatched the identification cards, held them for barely a moment, and shoved them back. He never scanned the security barcode. He never verified the official government seal. He never even bothered to look at the photograph to match it with the face of the man standing calmly before him. Instead, he ordered the chief to step aside for a secondary, undefined verification process. Meanwhile, right behind them, multiple other travelers who did not fit the officer's biased profile were waved right through the checkpoint with nothing more than a casual nod. None of them were asked to produce documents. None of them were detained. Have you ever experienced a moment where you knew with absolute certainty that you were being judged completely unfairly, yet you had to maintain your composure? Imagine the immense psychological discipline it took for this veteran commander to stay silent. The chief knew exactly what was happening because he had spent his entire career rooting out this exact type of toxic behavior in his own ranks. The transit officer had a documented history that was staggering in its audacity. Over the course of a decade, dozens upon dozens of formal complaints had been filed against him. The vast majority of these grievances involved unlawful detentions, verbal intimidation, and physical escalation targeting specific demographics, travelers who were subjected to unchecked bias simply because of how they looked. Yet protected by a deeply flawed internal review system and a supervisor who routinely buried the paperwork, this officer had never faced a single day of suspension. He had learned over 11 years that his prejudices would be shielded by his badge. He had grown so arrogant that he treated his post like a personal fiefdom. When the visiting chief calmly asked the officer to provide his badge number and the name of his direct supervisor, a fundamental right guaranteed to any citizen during a police interaction, the officer's ego snapped. He bypassed every legal standard of de-escalation, without a single verbal warning, without any lawful justification or probable cause. The officer lunged forward and grabbed the chief by the lapels of his jacket. The sheer force of the sudden assault violently twisted the chief off balance. His travel bag crashed to the floor, bursting open. Highly sensitive federal briefing documents, the very files detailing the systemic abuses he was sent to investigate, fluttered across the cold station floor. The morning rush hour suddenly froze. Dozens of commuters stopped in their tracks. Cell phones instantly materialized, their lenses locking onto the unfolding chaos. The officer aggressively drove the chief backward, slamming his shoulder into a heavy steel barrier. The impact knocked the chief's glasses off his face, sending them skittering across the tile. Then, applying a brutal and entirely unjustified level of physical coercion, the officer forced the chief's arms behind his back, drove a knee deep into his leg, and took him down to the hard floor. He pinned the veteran commander face down in the middle of the concourse, crushing his knee into the man's spine while viciously clicking a pair of steel handcuffs around his wrists. Throughout the entire agonizing ordeal, the chief never resisted. He never raised his voice. He never tensed his muscles. He exhibited the flawless restraint of a man who knew the law intimately, understanding that any physical reaction would be manipulated to justify the assault. With his cheek pressed painfully against the dusty floor, the chief spoke in a steady, measured tone. He informed the aggressive officer that he was an active chief of police operating under a federal mandate. He clearly articulated that the officer was currently committing criminal assault under color of law. And most importantly, he noted that every single second of this gross violation was being recorded by multiple cameras. The officer scoffed, arrogantly declaring that federal badges didn't carry weight in his terminal, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality rapidly closing in around him. What this rogue officer failed to realize was that this was not just an isolated mistake. It was the ignition of an institutional inferno. He was completely unaware that his own body-worn camera had been actively recording for over an hour. He didn't know that 5 high-definition security cameras mounted directly above them were capturing the assault from every conceivable angle. And he certainly didn't know that standing just a few feet away in the gathering crowd was a retired federal public defender with 3 decades of experience in constitutional law. Recognizing the scattered federal documents on the floor, the retired attorney immediately pulled out his phone, bypassed the camera app, and dialed Federal Emergency Dispatch. While the officer's knee was still grinding into the chief's back, the attorney loudly narrated the crime in real time, formally reporting a civil rights violation and requesting an immediate federal response to the transit hub. When the local transit police command staff rushed to the scene moments later, the atmosphere shifted from aggressive arrogance to sheer, unadulterated panic. The local commander arrived, took one look at the federal assignment letter lying on the ground, and realized the apocalyptic scale of their mistake. The expression that washed over the commander's face was one of pure dread, the terrifying realization that his subordinate had just publicly assaulted the exact federal authority dispatched to tear their department apart for doing exactly this kind of thing. The handcuffs were quickly removed. The local commander, attempting to salvage his career, pulled the battered chief aside and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He suggested they head upstairs to a private administrative office. He offered medical attention, gently hinting that they could handle this quietly through an internal review, keeping the federal authorities out of it. It was the classic, desperate playbook of a corrupt system trying to protect itself. But the visiting chief was a master of this game. He looked the panicked commander dead in the eye and dismantled his hope with surgical precision. He explained that he had run an internal affairs division for years and recognized every single tactic being deployed to sweep this under the rug. He pointed to the security lenses watching them from the ceiling. He pointed to the crowd of citizens holding their phones. And then, with devastating calmness, he informed the commander that the federal oversight monitor waiting for him at police headquarters had already been notified of his delay. The situation was no longer a local issue. It belonged to the United States government. Within 30 minutes, the transit hub was swarming with special agents from the Federal Bureau. They immediately locked down the area, secured every digital recording, and opened a sweeping criminal inquiry. By mid-morning, footage of the unlawful arrest was dominating national news networks. The sheer, terrifying irony of the situation captivated the public. The man tasked with hunting down institutional bias had been violently ambushed by it before he could even leave the train station. Do you think the truth would have ever seen the light of day if those cameras hadn't been rolling? Let me know your honest opinion down below. History tells us that systems protect themselves, and this department was no different. In a desperate bid to cover his tracks, the arresting officer filed a fabricated incident report claiming the chief had been wildly aggressive, physically combative, and posed a severe security threat. To explain away his lack of footage, he filed a secondary report claiming his body camera had suffered a catastrophic firmware failure shortly before the encounter. His supervisor blindly signed off on the lies, assuming the system would protect them as it always had. But digital forensics are unforgiving. Federal technicians easily extracted the raw data from the cloud servers, proving unequivocally that the camera had never failed. It had captured everything. The uncovered footage revealed a truth darker than anyone anticipated. It showed the officer watching the chief from afar, turning to a colleague and gleefully announcing his intention to target the approaching traveler, proving the confrontation was entirely premeditated. This prompted federal investigators to dig deeper, tearing through years of internal communications. What they unearthed was a massive coordinated conspiracy. They discovered private group chats where officers actively bragged about a twisted game they called the screen. The rules were sickeningly simple: intentionally target travelers based on prejudiced assumptions, unlawfully detain them, and force them out of the priority lanes. The officer who successfully harassed the highest number of innocent people each week won a cash prize funded by the rest of the squad. And the supervisors weren't just turning a blind eye, they were keeping score. The reckoning was absolute and merciless. A federal grand jury handed down severe indictments. The arresting officer was hit with heavy federal charges, including deprivation of civil rights, under color of law, evidence fabrication, and obstruction of justice. His supervisors and several fellow officers were dragged down with him, charged as co-conspirators in a sprawling criminal enterprise. During the highly publicized federal trial, the defense attempted to argue that the officer was simply following security protocols. But the prosecution didn't even need to argue. They simply played the unedited body camera footage to a dead-silent courtroom, followed by the damning text messages outlining their discriminatory game. The jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts in record time. The rogue officer was sentenced to a decade in federal prison and permanently stripped of his right to ever wear a badge again. His supervisors received multi-year sentences, losing their freedom, their pensions, and their legacies. But the pursuit of justice didn't end in criminal court. The visiting chief subsequently filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against the city. When they offered him an 8-figure settlement attached to a strict gag order, he outright refused. He wasn't interested in quiet money. He demanded total institutional reform. He demanded a public admission of guilt, the complete dissolution of the existing transit police force, the installation of an independent civilian oversight board with full subpoena power and a decade-long federal consent decree. When the city foolishly took the case to trial, the jury awarded the chief one of the largest civil rights verdicts in the nation's history, financially crippling the corrupt agency and forcing the city to agree to every single one of his reform demands. The old department was completely disbanded, its toxic roots pulled from the ground. In its place, an entirely new agency was built from scratch, governed by strict constitutional parameters and unforgiving transparency protocols. Almost a year to the day after the brutal assault, the veteran chief returned to that same Dallas transit hub. He walked off the morning train from the Midwest, wearing the same style of dark jacket, carrying the same leather bag. He walked with that same measured, unhurried stride. As he approached the priority corridor, his identification was visible in his hand, not out of fear, but as a silent testament to the battle that had been fought and won on that very floor. Standing guard at this entrance was a young, newly sworn officer, a member of the freshly reconstructed department. She saw the chief approaching. She didn't view him through a lens of suspicion or unfounded bias. She saw him for exactly who he was. As he neared the stanchion, she stepped back, offered a respectful nod of recognition, and simply said, "Welcome back, sir." The chief paused, returning the nod, acknowledging the profound shift in the atmosphere. He walked straight through the corridor, unimpeded, walking into a future that was just a little bit brighter, a little bit fairer, because one man refused to surrender his dignity in the face of overwhelming injustice. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the events that shape our world. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful lesson about accountability, and let's keep building this community together. Before you click away, drop a comment below. I would love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most about this incredible chain of events. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.